The idea was that their only real work was treating blisters. But everything changed once they were in combat. The medic Buddy Giannoloni said, "Overseas, it became different. They called you medic, and before you knew it, it was doc. I was 19 at the time." And when Ambrose talked to veterans during interviews, he would ask if they remembered any medics, and they would say something like, "Bravest man I ever saw. Let me tell you about him." Here's one account. Private Mike DeBello got hit by a machine gun bullet that ripped through the upper muscle of his right arm. And he said, "Doc Mellon was the bravest kid I ever saw. He came running right through the machine gun fire and put a tourniquet on my arm." Mellon got smashed by the concussion from an 88. His shoulder was out of his socket. He should have gone back to the aid station, but as he later explained, he felt, "There were just too many wounded guys to work on, so I took some codeine and morphine. I couldn't raise my arm beyond the waist, so here I was trying to work on these wounded guys with one hand." Under the Geneva Convention, to preserve their non-combatant status, the War Department didn't give the medics any combat pay, which would be $10 extra a month, or the right to wear the combat infantryman badge. This was bitterly resented, and in some divisions, riflemen collected money from their own pay to give the medics as a combat bonus. Regarding their right to wear the badge, 5 enlisted medics in the European Theater of Operations were awarded the Medal of Honor, and hundreds won silver or bronze stars. Medic Ed Grazsike of the 4th Division earned a Bronze Star. When his company underwent a shelling in the Hürtgen Forest, one of the sergeants was killed by shrapnel. Grazsike took a large fragment in the back of his head. He was unconscious, and beside him a third man was screaming for a medic. Lieutenant George Wilson ran to the wounded man and found him, he said, frantically gripping what was left of one arm with his remaining hand. The arm was gone, almost to the shoulder. As Wilson stared helplessly, Medic Grazsike came to. He told Wilson to get a tourniquet on the man, handed him some morphine, explained how to use it, then gave instructions as Wilson sprinkled sulfa powder on the raw stump and bandaged the wound. Wilson completed the job, and both the wounded man and Grazsike passed out. Wilson got a jeep to carry them back to the aid station. Both survived. So medics served in line companies. They were in the foxholes and static situations, but when Americans went on the offensive, sometimes medics had to stay behind with the wounded, feeling lonely and abandoned. When an attack failed and the men fell back, medics had to go between the lines to deliver aid and start the wounded men on their way to the field hospital. Private Byron Whitmarsh of the 99th Division described what it was like for the medics during a barrage. "There are worse things than being a rifleman in the infantry. Not many, but being a medic is one of them. When the shelling and shooting gets heavy, it is never long until there's a call for medic. That's when your regular GIs can press themselves to the bottom of their hole and don't need to go out on a mission of mercy." When the medic reached a wounded man, he would do a brief examination, put on a tourniquet if necessary, inject a vial of morphine, clean the wound, sprinkle sulfa, slap on a bandage, and drag or carry the patient toward the rear. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Private Robert Phillips, a medic with the 28th Division, came to hate the sound of incoming shells and the shouts of medic that forced him to leave his hole. As he worked, shell fragments whittled down the trees and casualties increased. He remembered the job of examining a wounded man at night, cutting away clothes in darkness, feeling for a wound. He said, "It's like putting your hand in a bucket of wet liver." Private Benedict Batista, a medic with the 90th Division, said, "I don't regret what I did, but if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't want to be a medic. I've seen too much blood. I'd want to be in a maintenance outfit." A medic had to work fast, and if he didn't do the job right away, he would lose a patient. Sometimes he had to deliver his first aid while under air enemy fire, because occasionally Germans would fire on a medic at work between the lines. Private Phillips was wounded while tending one wounded man. Private Louis Potts of the 26th Division was fired on Christmas Day, while attending a wounded soldier. He stayed in the snow-covered field and went to work on another casualty. When he went back to work, a German sniper got him in the forehead. But by and large, according to accounts, the Germans followed the Geneva Convention. Men wearing their Red Cross armbands did get shot, and sometimes it was because the Red Crosses hadn't been seen. The purpose of the crosses were to make themselves more visible, not less, so they began to wear 2 armbands and paint a red cross and a white square on their helmets. They thought that most Germans or GIs would respect the symbol if they could be seen. But this wasn't the case in the Pacific Theater, where medics were special targets of the Japanese and responded by taking off their armbands and even dyeing their bandages jungle green. Lieutenant Wenzel Andreas Borgert, who commanded a German anti-tank unit in Normandy, described an American attack in which 10 of his 15 men were wounded. He radioed for an ambulance, and he said in an interview, "And this much I acknowledge, that at the very second that the big red cross flag came over the hill behind me, the Americans stopped firing immediately. I can honestly say that made a big impression on me, because there was no such thing as a red cross on the Russian front."
Many times when the medic arrived, the man would already be dead.
Then they would have to haul the body back to the grave's registration crew. Bill Malden described one such group. Its personnel, he said, could have played the gravediggers in Hamlet. They were usually drunk, perhaps a necessary condition for their work, and they became callous having to perform this duty. Private Kurt Gable of the 17th Airborne described one event where he'd participated in the gruesome job of finding and piling up the dead from his outfit following an attack in a snow-covered field. The bodies were frozen. After a morning's work, Gable and his comrades had a large stack. A grave's registration crew drove up in a truck. 2 guys got in the back of the truck and 2 went to the pile. The 2 on the ground grabbed a body by the shoulders and legs and swung it 3 times to gain momentum, chanting 1, 2, 3, heave. The body flew through the air and landed with a thump. The men on the truck dragged the corpses to the far end and got ready for the next. Gable and a few of the men stepped forward, looking like the combat infantrymen they were. One of them touched his rifle and said in a matter-of-fact voice, "You do that one more time, and I'll blow your heads off." The men on the truck slowly climbed down, and the 4-man crew gently lifted the next body. As soon as possible, the men killed in action were buried in a small temporary cemetery. Then they were dug up and taken to a division or army cemetery in the rear. After the war ended, the family had the rights to have the bodies brought home, but many parents or widows declined, thinking their loved ones should remain where they fell. The largest such cemeteries are in Normandy and Luxembourg. Well, for what a medic did, Ken Russell, the 82nd Airborne, said that they could do more with less to do it than anyone. A medic typically didn't have that much. Morphine was the most important tool at his disposal because it would relax a wounded man and keep him from going into shock. In the Battle of the Bulge, to keep the drug from freezing, the medics kept it next to their bodies. One man carried it in his underwear top, others under their arms. Well, it was a temptation for some carrying so much morphine around a battlefield. During a shelling, one medic heard the cry, "Medic!" I said, "Oh." I got up and went in the direction of the call for help. It took him to the next platoon's area. He asked who was hurt. "Doc, look over there," said one of the GIs. There was a platoon medic, walking around like a zombie among the shell bursts. The other medic tackled him and discovered he had given himself morphine when the shelling began. Turns out he'd become an addict. Well, much like in the Civil War and World War I, it wasn't just the combat medics who were saving lives, it was nurses and physicians as well. Most patients came back to consciousness groggy from morphine in the field or evacuation hospital. The first thing they would see was a nurse from the Army Nurse Corps, or ANC. She'd be wearing fatigues and exhausted and busy. But many soldiers said that she looked like she was heaven sent. The first nurses to enter the continent came on June 10th at Omaha, just a few days after D-Day. Members of the 42nd and 45th Field Hospitals and the 91st 120th Evacuation Hospitals acted as a vanguard of the nearly 18,000 ANC who served in 1944 to 1945. This was 17 times as many ANC personnel as existed in the entire Army in 1942. There were nearly 60,000 by 1945. For many of these nurses, the first obstacle they had to overcome was volunteering, because there was a nationwide slander campaign about women in uniform. There were jokes told by rear echelon soldiers and civilians. But no one who had ever seen an Army nurse in action in a field hospital or any wounded soldier ever told these jokes. But still, it was difficult to sign up. Unlike men who enlisted as soldiers and often had the full support of their community and family, for nurses, a questionnaire showed that of those who did volunteer, 41% had to overcome the opposition of close relatives. Only half said their closest male friends were supportive, whereas 80% of their closest female friends supported their decisions. The Army Nurse Corps, in order to speed up recruitment, made it more attractive. From June 1944 onwards, nurses got officers' commissions, full retirement privileges, dependence allowances, and equal pay. The government also paid for the education of nursing students. President Roosevelt, in his January 1945 State of the Union address, referred to the critical shortage of nurses in Western Europe and proposed that the nurses be drafted. A bill to do so passed the House and came within one vote of enactment in the Senate. So you almost had a draft on females in 1945 in the United States. Well, in order to overcome this shortage, nurses who did serve at field or evacuation hospitals were badly overworked. The experience of the 77th Evacuation Hospital are typical of how they were overworked. It was a veteran outfit by mid-1944. It had been in England in the summer of 1942, then to Oran in November, on to Constantine in January 1943, and then in various other sites up to D-Day. On July 7, 1944, the 7th entered Normandy at Utah Beach. It set up in France at Sainte-Mère-Église and was open within a day. During the first 12 hours, it treated nearly 1,500 patients, or 2 per minute. In the first 6 days, the 77th handled 6,000 patients in triage. For the first week, patients came in at a rate of 1 per minute around the clock. Ambulances coming from the battalion aid stations had to pull up 3 abreast, in lines stretching back 200 yards. Doctors worked as fast as they could, but were only able to keep up with the litter bearers carrying patients in from the ambulance and out the back of the receiving tent. Litters were coming and going, but there was space for only 100 of them in the tent, which was always nearly filled, while the stretchers bearing wounded men lay in open spaces on the ground outside the tent. Along the sides of the tent sat the walking wounded, clutching their souvenirs. A tag showed whether and how much morphine the casualty had received from the medic. The doctors went from patient to patient, scanning the records, asking questions, and lifting the dressing to check each wound. Well, battlefield medicine has continued to evolve since World War II. From World War I to World War II, the percentage of those wounded who died in World War II, Vietnam, and Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom was 19.1%, 15.8%, and 9.4% respectively. Something that has been focused on in the last few decades is the golden hour and how crucial that is. Many studies of historical casualty rates indicate that nearly 50% of military personnel killed in action died from excessive blood loss, and about 80% go on to expire within an hour after initial injury. This first hour is crucial to survival in a casualty and is known as the golden hour. The death of the casualty can be prevented by immediate treatment of the hemorrhage within an hour after initial injury. And one of the main reasons that statistics have improved over the decades is due to tactical combat casualty care. It's a set of best practices for pre-hospital trauma care guidelines for battlefield use. That's because 90% of combat deaths occur before the casualty reaches a medical treatment facility. So the fate of an injured soldier lies in the hands of the person who provides the initial care to the casualty. So the goal of tactical combat casualty care is to identify and treat casualties with preventable causes of death and keep them alive to reach the hospital. So there you go. In the entire universe of combat medicine, there were many different stages to effective care. The field medic, the hospitals and battle tents right at the edge of the battlefield, and then the hospitals that are further back in friendly lines where they can get more ongoing treatment. But with the golden hour, we see that it really comes down to the combat medic. And tools like morphine and other things definitely help, but what makes a difference on how many soldiers survive a battle is how effectively combat medics can do their work and reach those in need. All right, well, thank you very much for the question. I really appreciate it. I'm always happy to hear your questions, do my best to answer whatever it is that you throw at me. Well, that's all I have for today. There's probably a million other things that could be said, but I think this is a good stopping point. First off, I want to give a shout out to the Spy Masters for the Knowlton's Rangers. Vic Austin, Chris, Rob Matlock, Alan Baker, Beverly Engel, Jake Harrington, Todd Warren, William Ivey, Joyce Normant, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Daniel Lawson, Marlene, Michael, Tim Clark, David Powell, Moondoggy from Ohio, Melissa, Christopher Maine, Carl from Norway, and Baron Fraser. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This